Starting. Okay, there we go. So now it should be, yeah, okay, should be all set up. So, all right, welcome back. Here with Dr. Graham Oppy. Dr. Oppy, thank you so much for coming on. And
it's a pleasure.
Talk to me. Yeah, good to have you. So, I think the broad title topic of the video is going to be defending naturalism, but we're going to kind of go through a lot of stuff and just get to kind of talk very generally about some hot topics in philosophy of religion. So, if you're cool with it, I say we could just kind of continue what we had started talking about a little bit, the email and everything, and talk a bit about Feser's Aristotelian proof and kind of the Aristotelian proof in general, and kind of some of the underlying metaphysics there, because we've talked a little bit before about like actus purus and then like the act potency distinction and things like that. Because you and Feser recently had your debate on capturing Christianity, just on the Aristotelian proof, and then now that's been announced there's going to be a follow-up to that, and then of course you submitted a paper on his Aristotelian proof, so and that was great. So just on the Aristotelian proof in general, what exactly inspired you to write that paper? Was it kind of your discussion, or did you reading his, I mean, obviously it was a little bit far-fetched, his claim about atheists not being part of the real debate anymore due to things like the Aristotelian proof. So was there any particular reason that spurred you on to write that paper?
Well, that was it, really. It was that claim in the book, because I thought I decided that I'd read the book. I've had a developing interest in the Thomistic arguments, and so I was interested to see what it had to say. And then I thought that it's really not that clear how the proofs are supposed to do any serious damage to, say, contemporary naturalist perspectives, right? Or how you could think that they do, right? So that's what motivated me to write that paper, and I wrote another one which I haven't tried to get published yet on the Thomistic argument. So,
ooh, that's a whole fascinating thing. So what you and Feser got into a little bit, and I think, if correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but I think in your paper you focused really on two premises of his argument. The formalized version, which is like 48 premises or something crazy like that. I think you focused on, I believe it was premises 4 and 7, and it kind of got into what you guys discussed with existential inertia. So would you mind kind of going over your general like objections in that paper and everything?
So I'm going to have to go and find a copy of the paper, which I have sitting somewhere handy. It's not there. Just hang on a sec.
No problem. Even the abstract.
Because, so it's just because I want to have the exact wording exactly right. So premise 4 says no potential can be actualized unless something already actualizes it. And premise 7 says the existence of S, some substance, at any given moment presupposes the concurrent actualization of its S's potential for existence. Now, I think that both of those premises are false. Right? So I have a series of metaphysical commitments, I guess, and following from those commitments, it turns out that those claims are false. So I think this argument couldn't possibly do any damage to my position because it just assumes things that I don't believe. Right. So that was that's the whole strategy of the paper. So I'm not undertaking to show that it's irrational to believe these premises, or that, by the lights of Thomas, these premises are pretty obviously true. Right. I know those claims I've got no reason to reject. The point was just, I think these premises are false, so how could this argument show anything about my rationality?
Yeah.
He might as well have just said, well, you don't believe that God exists, so you're irrational, right? I mean, you pick your claim, right? It doesn't matter whether it's the conclusion of the argument or one of the premises. Right? If he really meant it when he said, well, atheists are just out of the conversation because of this argument, then it seems to me a pretty solid reply to just say, well, look, they're false, and let me fill it out a little bit so I can tell you some of the other things I believe that sit around this. Right? So it's not just that I'm merely saying it. I really do believe that they're false, right? And there are reasons that I can give why I think that they're false, even if I don't think that those are reasons that should persuade Ed to think that it's false. Okay, so that's
awesome.
the kind of strategy.
Nice. Yeah, I think you've definitely demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that atheists are very much still part of the conversation, very much so. I know I'm looking forward to his reply on that. But yeah, because it seems like that's almost question begging then, because he's assuming these kind of metaphysical principles that like a naturalist has no reason to accept. And so it's kind of a problem or a critique about the whole like Thomist framework, is it's really a lot more highly controversial than they're honest about it being, it seems like.
So I'm not sure that it's dishonesty. And I'm
well,
sure
yeah, no,
that
not.
that Ed really believes all of these things and he thinks that they're true. But the kind of interesting question is about the attitudes that you should have towards the people who don't agree with
right.
you. Right.
For sure. Yeah.
Because you might have thought, what's the point of putting this into an argumentative form? What's the point of dressing it up as an argument? Why not just list the claims and then say, these are all true? Right? Just list all the premises and say they're all true. What difference is it supposed to make that we've given this in an argumentative form and we've picked out the conclusion eventually? I mean, not in my version because I only focused on the first part of the proof, but eventually you're supposed to get to the conclusion that God exists. Well, dressing it up as an argument, the point has to be, well, there's some inconsistency in people who don't recognize the force of this argument because they accept the premises and they don't accept the conclusion. I mean, that's how I assume how it goes. Well, if you don't accept the premises, then you just escape.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like that premise 7 is kind of gets us into like what's a really hot topic right now, becoming even more prominent and kind of really important to these kinds of proofs. Again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the premise 7 about like the concurrent causation or concurrent actualization, that's sort of assuming the falsity of, say, existential inertia. And I think you and Ed got into that a little bit, or is that premise 4? Yeah.
So one of the things that lies in the background here, and I can't remember whether Ed and I talked about this, is the idea that there's an important distinction between essence and existence of such a kind that existence is not part of the essence of things. Now, I think that's not right. So let me say a little bit about that. To start with, we need to explain what essences are. And in a way, I don't, because I'm a kind of nominalist, I don't believe in properties and I don't believe in essences, but there's a way of getting around this. We can say that a thing is essentially such and such, just in case. And so here's what I think you would require for something to be essentially of a certain way. That necessarily, if it exists, then it's intrinsically that way. Where the intrinsic properties are the properties that a thing has just in virtue of the way that it is, having nothing to do with anything else. Now, the way that I said that, I think that the existence of things is intrinsic to them. And so it's just going to turn out that everything has as one of its essential properties existing. I think that's good because I don't think that there are any non-existent things. Right? Everything exists. Right? There are no things of which the following is true. They don't exist, right? According to me. Now, people who go for the way that Ed does, for the distinction between essence and existence, might be committing themselves to non-existent things. They might be Monongians. They might think that there are lots of things that have being, but they don't exist. Right? So, for example, you might think that Monon's round square has being, but it doesn't exist, or that Santa Claus has being, but it doesn't exist, or that Bertrand Russell has being, but doesn't exist, at least, not now, and so on. But I don't want to go that way. I want to say all the things that have being and all the things that exist are the same, right? And everything exists. Of course, we can talk about things like Bertrand Russell. You can say things like it was once the case that Bertrand Russell existed, and that will be true. But that doesn't mean that Bertrand Russell right now has the property of having once existed. Right? There's nothing now that bears that property, according to me. Right? So I don't accept the idea that there's this separation of essence and existence, and that existence is not part of essence. But that's what lies behind, importantly, lies behind the Aristotelian proof that Feser's giving. So there's more deep-seated disagreement than I think emerged in the discussion that we're having. I'm sort of hoping that we might talk about these questions next time, but it's still up in the air exactly what we're going to talk about in the next discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that helps a lot. I think that's pretty intuitively rational. And even Josh Rasmussen, that I mentioned to him, agreed the same thing. He's like, I don't think there are non-existent things either. I'd agree with Graham there. You and Josh actually have a fair amount of common ground. It was fun to discover. But yeah, so that whole, because that gets into like sort of, I think what Feser draws as his Thomistic proof then too, the De Ante essay and that kind of, and so it seems like sort of that kind of Thomist view of essences underlies also the Aristotelian proofs if we have reason to reject that. So that seems more so on the existential inertia point. It kind of seems like naturalists, again, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe not all naturalists are committed to this, but naturalists are not going to have in their worldview sustaining causes, at least not in the same way theists do, because it seems like Feser at one point argues, concurrent actualizations and kind of subsistence in being. And of course, J.H. Sobel pointed out that, like, kind of just intuitively, we don't observe things being sustained. It seems like these things have the ability to persist in existence once they're created without any sort of sustenance. But so are there any other like considerations or positive arguments for existential inertia there, or against sustaining causes that are relevant?
So if you're a Thomist, you think that God's doing a lot of work because God's sustaining everything in existence from moment to moment, and God's also concurring with everything that happens, so that there's nothing contrary to God's will that happens as well. God has to concur with everything. So there's a lot of work there. And so on that picture, it doesn't fit very well, the idea that if something exists, it's just going to go on existing unless something forces it to go out of existence. But it seems very natural to me, and to, as you've just pointed out, to many theists other than Thomists, that things will just go on existing unless there's some cause that puts them out of existence. I see this, though, as related to the previous stuff about the distinction between existence and essence, because the existence turns out now to be something that's not intrinsic to the thing. The essence is what's intrinsic to the thing. The existence is some external thing that's imposed on the essence, and God's the thing that does the imposing. Right. So it's not that this is an independent point. It's related to the kind of underlying question about the relationship between essence and existence.
Okay. Yeah, so that seems to kind of be undercutting a lot of this. So is it correct then to say, I mean, naturalists aren't going to have any need for or view of sustaining causes? I mean, we're talking about naturalism. No. That's going to,
Right. No, that's right. And by naturalist lights, this is a plus. We've just got rid of some unnecessary metaphysical baggage. Quite a lot of it, if you count
Yeah.
God, as well as the sustaining causes and so on. Right. So there's a kind of argument from simplicity.
Yeah, for
Here,
sure.
you can explain all of the data. I mean, this is Sobel's point. You can explain all of the data equally well without supposing that there are the sustaining causes, so long as you just make this assumption that things will go. I mean, call it existential inertia if you like. Yeah. So
Yeah.
long as you suppose that there's that you've got that.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It just kind of, as we're talking about it, I thought about it, and it seems to me that like there doesn't seem to be any phenomena I can think of that we can't explain without appeal to sustaining causes, unless we go ahead and assume that existence has its distinction. But if we don't, it doesn't seem like, I mean, I don't know how one would make a positive case for a sustaining cause unless
Right.
it already established God exists.
That's right. And so some of the contemporary Thomists, I'm thinking, I guess Feser would be one of these. David Oderberg's another, and he's somebody that Feser draws on quite a lot, is going to insist on rejecting nominalism.
Right. Yeah, naturally, yeah.
Right. And insisting on real essences and real distinction between essence and existence, all of that stuff. Right. It's I think absolutely central to
I
at
think
least one sort of brand of contemporary Thomism.
Yeah, I believe most Thomists are committed to some form of like hylomorphic dualism and essentialism, at least. So they're kind of that's all built into their framework. But if we don't have that, so goes back, I think, to your point on the Aristotelian proof. If we don't have that baggage already, atheists have no reason to accept Feser's Aristotelian proof and even his De Ante because these premises are highly metaphysically controversial. And I mean, why accept that?
Yes, not just controversial, but it's kind of well known that there are pretty developed views that reject them.
Right? Yeah, more so than controversial. Yeah, that's even more in the doghouse than being just plain old controversial. Okay, yeah, that builds that into that too. I mean, that Thomist notion of sustenance is some huge metaphysical baggage that I personally don't want in my whole big picture. But okay, that gets through a lot. I'm really looking forward to seeing your guys' discussion and then Feser's response article, your further ones. That's going to be a really interesting, because it seems like Thomism's kind of been like, I don't know, this black sheep of theism. It's not as well known. It's kind of just been in like Catholic circles, and it seems like it's now becoming a little more towards the intellectual forefront with people who are sympathetic to it, like Alex Proust, and then, as you mentioned, Oderberg and Feser. So I don't know. It doesn't seem like many atheists have taken it on like in the literature yet. Unless there's something I'm forgetting.
I think you're right that there's been a gradual emergence from the shadows. I mean, there's the Thomist tradition never went away. There's a bunch of journals that Thomists have been assiduously publishing in, going back a very long time, but all through the era where the biggest names in philosophy of religion, Christian philosophy of religion, have been Plantinga and Swinburne. There's still lots and lots of activity by Thomists. And there's some really interesting stuff. I mean, some of the stuff that I found most interesting was the stuff that Anthony Kenny published after he ceased to be a believer. Right. Because there's some really he has some really interesting stuff, not just about the five ways, but about the De Ante Essentia stuff as well. So
okay.
Which I've drawn on quite a bit. I mean, I don't pretend that everything that I say about the Thomists I've just made up for myself. I know Kenny's a very important source.
Yeah, I know he had that book on the five ways and a lot more stuff just in general on the whole framework. So one thing before we move on from Feser and the Aristotelian proof, I wanted to ask you about, and I believe you mentioned this actually in your thing with Feser, and we've talked about before, but wanted to get your thoughts on. It seems kind of like central to, for one thing, Aquinas' argument for motion, and this is one thing that Feser's actually complained about that atheists haven't really dealt with in the literature, is this distinction that Thomas draws between, say, their accidentally and essentially ordered series. And I think you and Feser got into it briefly, but is it correct? If okay, so for part one of the question, it seems correct to say that essentially ordered series are, well, essential to these kind of arguments from motion and a lot of, like, that Thomist metaphysics in general. So I guess the second part of the question is, like, should we accept the existence of these theories? Because I know, like, for example, David Hume has arguments about just kind of like causal skepticism, about we're only really able to observe certain parts of causal chains. So to kind of extrapolate from what we can observe to kind of this giant hierarchy of causes may be too much. So I guess my question for you would be, for one, should we accept essentially ordered series? And if not, I mean, great, but if not, why not? And if so, and if we should accept them, what, how do we escape some of kind of the theist assumptions about causation? I mean, okay, so I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so I always struggle to remember which is which amongst the per se and the
per se and per accidens. Yeah.
Yeah.
So essentially ordered
so the
is
per accidens
hierarchical.
is the one father of father of father, and the per se is the kind of hand moving the stick, moving the ball. Right. So it's the latter that's supposed to be what Aquinas is talking about in his causal arguments.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be that. And it seems fine to me to say that there are some, I'll call them causal series, but anyway, instances of causation where you do have this thing, right? So I'm moving my arm, which is moving the stick, which is moving the ball. Were I to no longer will my arm to move, everything would stop fairly quickly. Right, so there's a bunch of things that are connected, and there's something at the back that's driving all of it. Right, unlike the past directed series, where whether I had children really was kind of independent of anything that my father did. Right, that's the way that Feser would describe it. Right, so I don't see that there's a problem with thinking that we can talk about causation in both of these ways. However, you don't get very far with the idea that there are per se causes in general, because, I mean, the example that we started with is there's nothing that's moving me, right? So it's not going to get you to God, it just gets you to me, right? And that's just not that interesting. So what Feser wants is a series that involves things having their existence from other things, that's a per se causal sequence. Right.
But that gets back into what you said already,
now, yeah, and that just takes us straight back into what we've already talked about.
Right. Yeah. Because he in his book in the Five Proofs book, when he talks about the Aristotelian proof, he talks about, like, a cup of water being held up by a table, which is held up by like a house, and eventually goes down to the earth. But then he brings it down to eventually everything is sustained in existence by God. And it seems like if we accept what we talked about earlier with existential inertia, we can just be fine with letting these series kind of peter out after 2 or 3 steps, and just being like, yeah, there's the kind of causal terminus of this whole thing, and doesn't get us any farther than that.
Right. So maybe he could have been clearer, because he didn't think that the cup being held up by the table that one was going to lead to God either, because obviously once you get to the earth, the whole talking about it's being held up ceases to make any sense. We don't even have a reference frame with respect to which the earth is held up. And I made that point in my article, and I know he thinks that was a waste of time because he wasn't really committed to it anyway. The only series that he's interested in is having its existence in virtue of something else's existence, going all the way back to God. That's the only way to get the argument to work. Interestingly, though, when Thomas gives his arguments in the 5 ways, none of them turns out to be that argument, right? A series of things, each of which has its existence in virtue of something else. right, has its existence imposed on its essence, right, by something else. And it strikes me as odd because where he does give that argument in the earlier work, it was available to him, and you would have thought that, I mean, it's very easy to cast it, so it just fits the model of the other 5 ways, right? You can just, and in my book on naturalism, I actually just present the argument the way that he could have presented it, right, as another one of the ways of proving the existence of God. And it's slightly odd to me that he didn't do that, given that it now kind of turns out that that's the key argument.
Yeah.
At least according to contemporary timers. But there's lots that I still don't understand about the 5 ways. So
yeah, there's centuries of literature on that. Good. Yeah, it's a lifelong project, really. But okay, that's definitely helpful. Thank you. One thing I think you guys just kind of started to touch on this, and there's kind of been, I know you wrote about it in Philosophical Perspectives on Infinity, which I have here, and then I think a little bit in Arguing About Gods as well. But one thing you guys sort of touched on, but I don't think got super deep into, was principles of sufficient reason and what role they play. Because I know in Philosophical Perspectives on Infinity, you kind of present a modal collapse argument for the stronger versions of the PSR, and then some reasons to think that some of the weaker versions kind of eventually kind of end up entailing that stronger one, and so we should eject them. And so there's kind of been some more recent literature in the PSR since all that with, I know Alexander Proust published a whole book on it. And so I wonder if you have any, well, I guess this is a kind of another multi-parter, but do you think there are still modal collapse critiques that are relevant to some of those principles? But if not, is the PSR a problem for naturalism? It seems to me that we can be fine with accepting the PSR, at least weaker versions, but I guess just kind of, because I know you and Ed didn't get super deep into this, but this is kind of a lot of the meat behind a lot of these theistic arguments, especially when you get to things like contingency, is kind of PSR and what version of it we should accept. So I guess that's the last part of the question, is if we do have to accept a PSR, what's the best version? But I know I gave you a lot there. I can recap any.
So when you're thinking about this, I think it's kind of helpful to just step back and think in general terms about what, think of there being this just causal web or explanatory web, if you want to make it more general, and then just think about what it can look like, right? Some of its general features. So abstracting from the debate between theists and atheists, just think about, okay, so what in general can this big picture look like? Can every particular thing have an explanation, right? Well, think about the totality. It's looking difficult for that to have an explanation because there's nothing in terms of which you could explain it. Maybe, though, you can think, well, there's a certain sense in which either the totality or whatever's at the boundary is necessary, right? And that's a kind of explanation. Why is it like that? Because it had to be. Why did it have to be like that? I say at that point, explanation just runs out, right? Necessity's a brute, right? If something's necessary, then it's so no matter what. If you could provide a reason, that would be a what, right? It's incoherent, I think, to look for explanations of why things are necessary. Right. Now, so that's one bit. That makes it look as though maybe we can explain everything except for the necessity of whatever it is, whether we think that it's somehow or other features of the entire framework or just features at the beginning, or I think bits of both, because I think, maybe there's something like laws or maybe there's something like powers, and we have to think of those as primitives as well as, as necessary, but hence primitives. Yeah. Right. The other thing that you might have in the picture, though, is cases where you've got, say, indeterminism. So the way that I like to think about this is think about two worlds that are the same up to a certain point. And then in one of them, you get one thing happening, and then in the other world, you get a different thing happening. Now, what do we want to say? There's an explanation in each of the worlds of why this thing happened, whichever world we're in, right? There was the history up to a certain point, and then it's just a matter of chance which one you get, right? That's the full explanation. But if you think about, is there an explanation of why you got this thing rather than that thing? In this world, A happens, it could have been B. Why did we get A rather than B? To that, there's nothing to which you can appeal that you can point to that explains why you got one rather than the other. So this is my definition of what a chance event is. So the other question is, are there chance events? And some people think there are quantum chances. Some people think that libertarian free choices are chancy in just this sense, right? They don't have, there's nothing that explains why you get one result rather than another. Should we think, if there are chances, that these are violations of the principle of sufficient reason? Right. Or should we think that, putting it differently, should we think that we should tailor our principle of sufficient reason so that it takes account of whatever chances there might be? Right. So having said that, now, theists and atheists are kind of in the same boat. There's this question about whether we want to have brute contingencies at the beginning or whether we want them to be brute necessities. And there's this question about whether we want to have chances or not. You might think that what a principle of sufficient reason should say is that everything has an explanation except for brute necessities and whatever chances there are, where what doesn't have an explanation is the contrastive fact, why this rather than that. And it seems to me that whether you're a theist or an atheist, you can accept that principle of sufficient reason.
Okay.
Indifferently. That's my view. So I actually don't, I'm not really very fussed. And this is slightly different from what I said in Philosophical Perspectives on Infinity, but it's the view that I've come around to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know you've changed your mind on a couple things in that book.
I've changed my mind about lots of things.
Yeah, as I mean, all philosophers should. So that's good. Okay, so it seems then like, again, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but it seems then like any kind of like stronger PSR, or even if we're going to take one that tries to take account of like eliminating all brute or all uncaused events, it seems like that PSR then would kind of have problems with, say, libertarian free will. And it seems like libertarian free will, at least in the case of one causal agent being God, is sort of necessary or essential to theism. Is that accurate, you think, that like the sort of that if a PSR tries to avoid leaving those chances or bruteness, it's going to kind of have to be problematic to reconcile with libertarian free will?
It might not be that, or maybe this is a different aspect of the same thing. There's a question about whether God could have made a different universe from
Right.
the universe that we actually have. And that looks like, and especially if you kind of inclined to push in the direction of anything like divine simplicity or something like, or something like that, it looks as though chance is going to be your only option, right? God makes this world, this universe in this world, God makes that universe in that world. Is there any difference in God between the two worlds? Certainly if you're a Thomist, you're going to say no.
Right.
Okay, so what explains the contrastive fact, right? It's not even a question about freedom. I mean, since we're talking about Thomism, it's really not that clear that Thomas himself believed that we had libertarian freedom. It looks like he may well have been, although he didn't kind of explicitly talk about it, it's not clear whether he wasn't some kind of compatibilist, actually. I say that only because I've supervised a couple of PhDs of Catholic priests. That's what they tell me on their reading of Thomas. They're really not that confident that he's a libertarian. So, yeah.
So you have it on good authority. Okay. Yeah, that seems to be, and this is a really a big point that kind of helped me in thinking about contingency arguments. Both listening to you talk about it, and then Robin Lepoidevin has a book called Arguing for Atheism, where he devotes a chapter to contingency arguments. And so it does seem like at some level it's hard to explain, like why God created this universe. Because I've talked to some Thomists, and it seems like occasionally they want to fall back into the position that like this is the best of all possible worlds, but that just seems pretty patently absurd. So if we can push people to that point, that's kind of a good win. That's a good win for naturalism, it seems like to me. But so I guess one question for starters is why should naturalists prefer, say, a brute necessity to a brute contingency? If it's going to be kind of brute either way, is there any explanatory advantage we get from necessity that we don't get from just something that's brutally contingent?
So I think that this is a question equally for theists, right?
Right, yeah.
Right, because is there any advantage in supposing that God's brutally necessary as opposed to brutally contingent, right? I mean, if there's some advantage, it's going to be something not about the particular case, but some general point about what kinds of primitives it's better to have. Now, lots of people like brute, I think, like to have lots of possibilities, right? I mean, this goes along with the kind of view that somehow or other, if you can conceive of things, they're possible, right? So, and obviously conceivability is pretty, or at least imaginability is pretty liberal. So you should have lots of possibilities. Whereas I'm inclined to think that you want as few possibilities as possible. So as in as few possibilities as you can build into your theory, and have a little bit more necessity, right? So that's why. But having said that, I'm not wedded to this. Like, I wouldn't die in a ditch for it. It's just this is the way my intuitions go. I think you only need possibilities for chances, right? Because you definitely need those. If things could go this way and that way, then there's a possibility there. I mean, a metaphysical possibility. I'm not talking about epistemic or doxastic possibilities. Right? I don't see any other need for possibilities. This is very much a minority view. I only know two other people that I've talked to who have been tempted by this view. One of them's John Heil, and the other one's Ned Hall. So, and I don't think that Ned goes for it in the end. But right, if you take that view, you end up with not many possibilities. You end up with a little bit more necessity.
Okay.
But you know. Anyway, that's the view. Yeah.
But it seems like you're committed, or at least lean towards a view on which, you know, even if we have this brute necessity as kind of our grounding, we're still going to have brute contingencies. And I remember it was really interesting to me in your article. It was an old paper you wrote. Your kind of like your version of why you're not why I'm not a Christian. It's kind of like your updated version of Russell's thing. I remember you said that like with theism, we just kind of get a lot of more brute contingency, but we just add, like, we have at least the same amount of brute contingency. We just add a lot to our ontological baggage. So we don't really get any progress here by adding theism. So is that still something it seems like kind of
right? So that would be the right. So that would. I mean, what I was thinking about there was the universe problem. God made this universe, but could have made lots of others. It just looks like we've now got a huge amount of brute contingency in our view, right? And we might as well have just sat with, well, the universe is brutally contingent.
Right.
That, as far as that argument goes, I mean, I think in general, for the reasons that I kind of alluded to before, that I'd like to get rid of brute contingencies as far as you can. I mean, you've got to have them if you're going to have chances, but why multiply them beyond that?
Right. Yeah, why multiply them beyond necessity? Yeah, right. So this is kind of similar but related, and I think because of course theists are going to want to deny a lot of, I shouldn't say all, because I mean obviously someone like Richard Swinburne is fine with brute contingencies. He's actually, that's his view. So not all theists, but a lot, especially in kind of the new rise in classical theism following guys like David Bentley Hart or Alex Proust and Rasmussen. A lot of these kind of new theists, they're going to want to not only limit, they're kind of, you know, prone to trying to eliminate bruteness as much as possible, or at least these brute contingencies. And so as far as reasons we have to think that these contingencies are inescapable, I've kind of just intuitively been drawn to Robin Lepoidovin's argument he makes in his Arguing for Atheism book. If it's wrong-headed, you can tell me, but what he talks about is how like a necessary fact or a necessary thing can't in principle be the entirety of our explanation, even as a virtue of what it is, because, and this kind of gets into your point about why God chose this world, we're going to assume, and a key premise of a lot of theistic arguments is that this world's contingent. And now, but so when we're trying to explain a contingent thing, appeal to a necessary thing is only going to get us so far, because we're trying to explain why this world is the only one that contains an actual universe in it as opposed to some other. And so merely appealing to something that exists and manifests in all possible worlds doesn't really help us, and at least it doesn't get us all the way to explaining why this world exists as opposed to some other, because a feature that all worlds share is not something that explains why this one exists, at least on its own. So that's something I've always kind of been drawn to. Is that?
Yeah. So I think that's right, and that sounds very similar to what I was saying before.
Yeah, I
Actually,
thought so.
Yeah, and either God's got to vary between the worlds, so something like God's plans have to vary to explain why you get the different universes, or else it's just mere happenstance that you get one rather than another. Right? There isn't. It's not like there's a third option here. So that's just repeating what Robin said.
Yeah, because it seems like almost arbitrary then, because we have to explain this, and there's no metaphysical principle we can appeal to explain why God chose this universe. There's no natural theology that's going to get us there. It doesn't seem to me.
So one thing that I should say, going back to something you said before, if you go down Leibniz's route and you say there's just one possible world, so then it turns out everything's necessary, and according to me, causation just disappears from the picture altogether. Nothing depends on anything now, because pick anything, it was going to happen no matter what, right? That's what necessity means, right? So now people might try to get around this by trying to argue for some notion of dependence that can hold between necessary things. I just think that that's incoherent. Now, we could argue, you could argue more about that, but I think that people who are inclined to go in Leibniz's direction underestimate the costs that they're now.
Oh yeah, because that commits one then to like
bear.
A really pretty hard form of determinism for one thing, and also then it seems like if there's only one possible world, why do we need theism? So that doesn't seem to be the route anyone's going to want to go.
Well, I think that's right too. I mean, it just seems like if everything's necessary, you can hive off God, because you don't need a necessary God if you're inclined to that view. Just have the one necessary universe and you're done. It just seems like a simpler view. So, yeah, there is that point also.
Yeah, so it seems like any explanatory advantage we get from theism is going to be undercut by its addition of kind of at least more of the same root contingencies. There's no reason, and this gets into talking about simplicity. But before that, I think there was another point you had that's kind of related to this, and we may have covered it already. But in your book on infinity, again, one quote you had that kind of also stuck with me, I thought was really interesting, is so we're talking a little bit about like possible worlds and like God's choices, but then I know you've also done work on like God's attributes, and so at one point in the book you say that like any insistence on God's divine aseity, so any view on which that he's kind of like him and his properties are radically independent, I believe in the book you said that you think any kind of like harsh insistence on that view is going to lead to the conclusion that these attributes of God are just brutally contingent. So if we're just kind of going to insist that God and these attributes of his are just kind of radically independent of anything else, it's going to lead to these attributes being brutally contingent. So that's a little different than the point we're talking about with like God's intentionality. But do you think you would still like defend that claim? Because it's an interesting point with God's attributes.
So I have to go back and have a look at exactly what I said, because I'm not remembering this. So, but also there's a kind of interfering factor, because I wrote a fairly long book on the divine attributes in between.
Yeah.
So
there'd be some overlap.
There's quite a bit of discussion in there. There's a chapter on grounding, which is kind of related to and grounding and fundamentality. Where can God be fundamental? What about God could be fundamental? And so I don't remember. I actually don't remember what I said.
So it was in your section towards the end of the book on infinite regress and sufficient reason, on the section on self-explanation and sufficient reason. So So you say, so to kind of set this up, you said, it seems to me to be plainly true that no true proposition, fact, or obtaining state of affairs or feature of the world can be explained in terms of itself. If one asks why S, one can never be satisfied with the alleged explanation because S. So you said, I think one
Right.
might be perfectly well satisfied with the claim that S has no explanation, or that no explanation is known.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, but the quote I was talking about is, like this on the next page. You say, let's see, you say, however, it seems to me that any insistence on God's atheity, that is, on the radical independence of God and God's attributes, is bound to lead instead to the conclusion that those aspects of God's existence have no explanation. A, because A is always explanatory syllogism, hence
Yeah.
A explains A can never be true. So yeah.
Right. Okay. But one thing that you could say is that they're necessary, right?
Yeah.
And that will be an explanation. But then their being necessary will itself be something that has no explanation. So that's the only modification that I would now make to
Okay.
what was
Yeah, I see
said
that.
there.
Because that's an interesting point I got into discussing with people recently too, is like a lot of people who affirm the PSR especially want to just say that a necessary thing is explained in virtue of its necessary nature. So the fact that it is necessary is what explains it, and so it's not brute. But it seems like you're tempted by a view, and I am too, that like, to say like something is necessary, it's like, well, why is it necessary? And the explanation, it wants to just peter out at like, well, because it's necessary. But like, do we need an explanation then for why things are necessary, or should we inquire that way? Because it seems like most people want to just cut it off. Like once you say something's necessary, it's like,
Right.
well, that explains all of it. Is that true?
So I guess I think we should cut off inquiry at that point because we've reached the end, but not because there's an answer to that question. It's
Okay.
that's where you just run up against bruteness, right? And when you're constructing your theory, you want to minimize the amount of bruteness that there is in the theory, right? So you don't want to do too much of this. That's kind of what's one of the things that's wrong with the Leibniz's there's only one possible world. Everything turns out to be brute, right? Which is
We don't want that. Yeah. If we
just
can
really
avoid
bad.
that.
That's about as bad as a theory can be.
Yeah, if everything's brute, it doesn't seem to be. Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting and helpful principle for kind of thinking about things in general and kind of proffered explanations and how to think about like what explanation actually means and like what it means for something to be explained. So that's definitely helpful. So this gets into something I want to talk about with you a little bit. I know we emailed about this a little bit. I don't know which way to go first. Basically, the point about simplicity, because I know that's a big thing for you. Because I know at one point you endorsed the view that we kind of don't have any arguments for either side that should compel people to change their minds. I mean, I'd agree. I think we kind of don't have any arguments. So then we go the route of kind of this abductive approach of like which theories have the best virtues as opposed to minimizing vices. And so we kind of get, it seems like you're arguing, I know in your book, The Best Argument Against God, you talk about how if these arguments don't offer us any reason to prefer, we should just go with what's simpler, which would be naturalism. And so I know we emailed about this a little bit, but I wanted to have it on record as well and talk about it because it's a point I've kind of run up against recently with people like, well, with professional philosophers like Josh Rasmussen a little bit, but also with just people who discuss these things kind of more like my age and everything. And that, it seems to be, and then I know also Trent Doherty was doing a video series on this, kind of inspired by some of Swinburne's stuff. And so some people want to actually somehow try to deny the idea that like naturalism is simpler. And so there are a couple of reasons they may do this. For one thing, they'll just appeal to, I think the one I've heard is that while naturalism has maybe fewer ontological entities, it has more that are fundamental, whereas theism just gives us one fundamental entity, God, and we don't have to posit. Because I think I was talking to somebody about this, and they cited in your discussion with Feser, you offered the idea that maybe our metaphysical ground floor is just like this brute fact that electrons have a negative charge. Like maybe that's just the ground of our metaphysics, and we go from there. And so then Feser wanted to argue that like, well, you're just kind of then committed to the same thing I am, just a lot more of them. And so that's kind of the route some theists want to go. They want to say that like, with theism, we just have this kind of one foundational thing that kind of grounds all other stuff. So we may have this natural stuff plus God, but like that still is simpler than kind of, because they'll go the route then that naturalism can't explain. I think a lot of these points actually just evolve into the debate about explanatory power and not about simplicity. But it is an interesting question, and I definitely am very confident that naturalism is a simpler theory than theism, but people seem to want to argue against that. So I did want to pick your brain a little bit
Yeah,
on, you know,
sure.
kind of answering
So
some of those objections.
So the principle that we were working with is that you should go for the simpler theory. And there's a question about what makes for the simplicity of a theory. And it's not the simplicity of what you identify as the kind of the salient fundamental entity, right? When you're working out what the theoretical costs of a theory are, you have to think about, okay, how many different kinds of entities does it postulate? How many different primitive predicates do you need in stating the theory? How many axioms do you need in order to state the theory? And so that's roughly sort of ontological, ideological, and then principles. And you want to be simple across all of them, right? I mean, if two theories are otherwise explanatorily equal, but one of them's simpler in one or more of those dimensions and not on the others, then you'll prefer the simpler theory. Something like that is the principle. Theists have a primitive commitment to electrons, no less than naturalists, right? Take the claim that God exists and do the derivation that gets me to the existence of electrons without adding anything else. You can't do it. There is no such derivation, right? What you have to realize is that most of our predicates don't have explicit definitions. So our ideological commitments are massive, right? We have a primitive use of cat, electron, star, and so on. But we also, if you're a theist, you have a bunch of other predicates which the naturalist has no use for, that are primitive as well. So ideologically, it's kind of obvious that the theist is going to do worse than the naturalist. But when you come to kinds of things that you've got primitive commitments to, it goes the same way, right? I mean, there's a sense of fundamentality here, which is irrelevant to the assessment of the complexity of the theories, because the theist says God made the electrons, right? So I'm only committed to God. But their theory talks about electrons. And from a theoretical point of view, that's just a primitive commitment. So it's not true that as a theory, theism comes out simpler. It comes out way more complicated. As, for example, I can remember some exchange somewhere where Paul Moser just said, yeah, this is obvious, right? There's the world versus there's the world and God and a bunch of other things, right?
Yeah.
Miracles and so on, right? There's just lots of extra stuff. You might think that in some sense, there's a kind, it's not simplicity. There's a kind of satisfying story here because God makes everything else. And so that means that your starting point for your theorizing, ignoring all the rest of the theory, is very simple. But that's just irrelevant when it comes to the question of theory choice. So this is what I think. This is what I think is the main thing that I would want to say in response to Josh Rasmussen's recent book, right? Because he makes a big deal about the simplicity of what's fundamental, but he forgets about all the things that are fundamental every time he's got something chancy. That's just fundamental. Every time he uses a predicate, it's fundamental, right? He didn't give an explicit definition of cat, and he couldn't, for example, but he thinks that there are cats. And so on. Anyway, so that's my take.
Okay, yeah, that's super interesting. So it seems like also, it's important to pin down that like it's not just the amount of things that are important. It's kind of important the category of these things as well. And I would talk about this because it seems to me, this may be wrong, but I was thinking about this, and I think I mentioned this in one of our exchanges in just terms of like categories of things. It seems like, postulating one entity versus one entity is not always going to be the same in terms of simplicity. So like one angel as opposed to one like rock, I don't feel like that's the same ontological commitment, partially because of like one thing's going to have a lot more properties. So that's one thing I like to point out too when people bring that up is like, we're not just talking about the number of things. Like I could have, say I bite the bullet on your point and say I'm committed to more fundamental things than you are. I feel like I can still get through the simplicity point because the kinds of things I'm committed to are just, in virtue of what they are, a lot simpler than the one thing that you're postulating.
Right. So there is a debate about whether numbers of things matters at all. So a friend of mine, Daniel Nolan, has a paper where he argues that it does matter, but there have been lots of people, David Lewis is one example, who thought that all that matters is the kinds, right? And the numbers of the actual things is irrelevant. I'm a kind of an open mind about this, but maybe I agree with Daniel Nolan. Maybe I think that the numbers matter too. But you're right that if absurdly your theory was that there's just one thing and it's an angel, and my theory is there's just one thing and it's a rock, it's going to be very hard to assess those theories for their simplicity, right? And I just think you can't do it. But that's not how the assessments of simplicity are going to work, particularly in the framework that I've got, because I think that in lots of cases, there's kind of no algorithm for working out which is the best theory once you start trading off simplicity against breadth and depth of explanation. You might have two views and you just think you can't actually make an assessment of which one's better. But in a case where you've got one theory that's committed to some things and another theory that's committed to all of those things and some more, then so long as they turn out to be explanatorily equal, you know which one is the theory that you should be going for. And that's the only kind of case that I'm kind of interested in the best argument against God. I'm interested in seeing how far you can run with the idea that you can make an argument for naturalism on those grounds.
Okay.
Right?
That's a very,
everywhere,
I like
everywhere the explanation's at least as good, but it's definitely simpler, so it wins.
right. And I really love that approach because it's so epistemically humble. It's like, look, our arguments don't work like they shouldn't. And like I've had friends talk about this too. Like, there's no argument I could ever give, like, being an atheist, there's no argument I could ever give to Alex Proust that he wouldn't be able to give me a good answer.
Yeah.
And in the same way, there's no question another undergraduate theist would give you that you wouldn't be able to answer. So it's like, it seems like, and you've made a similar point about like you go up to Flanagan or Swinburne, they're going to be able to, talk up and down.
Yeah.
So it just seems like people, are going to, never going to be an argument that is going to, like a silver bullet in philosophy where you're just going to have to change your mind. And so that's why I really like your approach there. That's admitting that it's like, look, I'm not saying our arguments are perfect. We have some silver bullet against theism, but like we just win the Occam's razor battle. So I appreciate that approach, and I think it's one people should adopt because it kind of gets us along with this epistemic humility of like, hey, we don't know, and that's ultimately going to be the answer to a lot of things. But so a further point on Josh, you mentioned Josh and Josh's book, and so one case another way he builds like a case for simplicity is just arguing that like, so we have a lot of things that we know exist, like say persons, minds, to some extent, qualitative experience or qualia, natural things like these powers. So he kind of lists off and has this approach, like he lists off all these things like we know exist, and so he's not really adding any ontological category with his foundation because he thinks the foundation just has, and this is the point I wanted to get your thoughts on too, is he thinks the foundation just has these things we're already committed to existing, but just to a greater degree, and then the arbitrary limits are shaved off. So he actually thinks that he seems to take the approach that any arbitrary limit on, say, his foundation's power or actuality or like mental properties, any limitation on that is going to be arbitrary, and therefore that's going to be something more we have to explain. It's going to be brute. So in the sake of simplicity, he wants us to shave off these arbitrary limits and then just say that the things we already see exemplified in the natural world that we know exist just exist to a higher degree without the arbitrary limit shaved off. So we don't have to explain that these things exist, but arbitrarily. We can explain why these things exist in virtue of there being something without arbitrary limits, so ultimately more simple. So he goes that route of saying that it's easier to explain kind of these, I don't know if you want to call them properties or phenomena we see in the natural world. It's easier to explain those, and his theory is simpler because he wants to shave off these arbitrary limits. And if we don't, then it seems like trying to explain why we see these things, we're going to have to instantiate some sort of arbitrary limit on properties like minds and persons, such that it's going to be more complex. And so he actually agrees with you that very much that simplicity should be valued, and he stresses this in his book a lot. He just kind of reaches, of course, a different conclusion because of this kind of principle. So I kind of wondered what you thought about that general approach, because it's interesting, but there's a couple moves there that are suspect at best. So I'm curious.
So there's something reminiscent about some of Swinburne in this as well. So Swinburne's, well, there are kind of three simple things: 0, 1, and infinity. Everything else is complex. And then you ask him about the Trinity, which is neither 0 nor 1 nor infinity, and it seems kind of, well, anyway. So that's one kind of question, is going to be, okay, what's the full story about this thing that's at the foundation, right? You told me a little bit about it when you told me about these unlimited properties that it's got, but I'd like to know the full story before I'm going to make any judgments about whether it's simple or not. And if you're a Christian, there's a whole lot of stuff about the incarnation and the Trinity and so on that we haven't been told anything about yet. And it would be very premature to make a judgment about simplicity without hearing the rest of the story. So that's one thing that I definitely would want to say. I think that, I mean, there's a kind of general methodological point here. If we're going to compare worldviews, you should put as much of the possible of the worldview on the table for comparison at the beginning, so that we can make a fair assessment of exactly how simple it is, where the complexities lie, what principles we've got. Right? It's, to me, kind of frustrating that there's been this long, though perhaps you might think that there's an explanation for this, but that there's been this long now established practice of focusing on some very austere version of theism and arguing about that, a very austere view of God and arguing about that, when nobody thinks that that's the full story, right? So that we're not going to find out how naturalism goes against a worldview if we just focus on this tiny corner of the worldview. That's just not going to be a fair comparison. Anyway, so that's the second thing. Third thing, it's a kind of interesting question how you get from God has an unlimited mind to we have limited minds, that our possessing limited minds is explained by the existence of an unlimited mind, particularly in the light of evolutionary theory, because it looks as though there's a kind of perfectly adequate naturalistic explanation of the existence of the kinds of creatures that we are, that just has no interest in whether or not there's an infinite mind. So that's a third kind of question that I want to ask, whether, exactly how is this explanation supposed to go? Where do you actually need the appeal to this? On what work really is this fundamental thing going to do for us? Are we going to be saying, actually, there's stuff that's wrong with evolutionary theory? So there's another question. I'm sure I haven't picked up all of the things I wanted to say. But.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And that's a good point, too, because that gets into like explanatory power, because Josh builds the minds thing into only being able to be explained by, say, theism, and he has like his Kantorian argument against reductive materialism. But of course, reductive materialism is a pretty minority view, even in naturalist accounts of the mind. So, so one move, there's a couple moves with his kind of move there that I think are a little bit suspect at best. We may not have to accept, and I kind of wonder what you think. So, for one thing, I mentioned this, and this ties into our talk about simplicity, and I think I mentioned this briefly before, but we didn't get too much into it. But when we're talking again about categories of things, he wants to shave off these arbitrary limits, and thus the absence of these arbitrary limits is going to be simpler. But what I'm not sure about is the move then that the property of, like, say, omnipotence, like something having the property of omnipotence or omniscience or omnibenevolence or omnipresence, that all these like divine attributes that we get from supposedly shaving off these arbitrary limits, I'm not sure that they actually turn out being simpler than, say, having some brute limit. Because I mean, it just seems like, and we talked a little bit before about kinds of things. A divine attribute seems, at least to me, intuitively, to be a pretty hefty ontological commitment. And so I'm not sure it's actually simpler to go that route than it would be to either have A, a contrastive explanation, or B, just even if we were to bite the bullet on, say, a brute arbitrary limit, it seems then to me that if we have to take some bruteness, but then avoid having to accept omnipotence. But then, of course, it's not just omnipotence; it's whole range. But even just for the sake of the conversation, it seems like it might actually be able to preserve the simplicity by biting the bullet on that bruteness and avoiding this jump to having this property of omnipotence in our framework. So, what do you think about that?
Right. So that's true. It's going to be one of the savings, one of the benefits of naturalism, that you suppose that omnipotence isn't instantiated. So
right.
there's there's a kind of thing, namely the omnipotent kind of thing, that you have no commitment to. So that's definitely going to be a saving. There's also a question about, maybe I hadn't really thought about this until now, about where else complexity is going to emerge if you commit yourself to omnipotence. It seems like you better be able to give an explicit definition of it, but that's proved enormously difficult, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's just part of the same point, that if you don't think that it's instantiated, you don't have to worry, right?
Right.
If you think that the powers of things are kind of the powers that there aren't really more powerful agents than us, than organisms like us. Maybe there are aliens with similar powers, maybe not. But then the idea of something way more powerful is something that you're just not, as an agent, way more powerful is just something that you're not countenancing. You don't have to countenance the agent, but you also don't have to countenance the powers.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It seems like any of these divine attributes are going to entail at least some more that we're going to have to explain. And of course, we're talking the language of just omnipotence. But as I said, I mean, if we take the whole kind of theist framework, there's a lot more than just omnipotence that we have to deal with and add to our framework. I mean, we have a whole host of divine attributes, which, as you say, have kind of all proven to be notoriously difficult. So yeah, that's another interesting point too, of like what do these properties entail that we're then going to have to explain. So it seems like there's a point there. The other thing I thought about this, and I mentioned this to Josh, and as I told you, he sort of almost ceded the point, but they kind of then thought he preserved his point. But one thing that seems to me is this kind of principle he builds in, this causal principle about what the foundation has to have to produce certain things. I'm not sure if that causal principle is even something we have to be committed to. I'm not going to say it's false. It's hard to like falsify it. But basically, so what he does is he says that, like, since this thing is instantiated, then the foundation must have the resources to produce this thing. It's like if we see minds, then the foundation of reality must have the resource to produce minds. And as I mentioned to you before, I think, and I'm curious to see what you think about this, because Josh seemed to tentatively agree with parts of it, is that I'm not sure that move's even justified, because it seems to me, we talk a little bit about higher order potentialities, but it seems to me at least plausible that, say, the foundation doesn't have the power to produce minds, but it has the power to produce a state of affairs that may have some chancy contingent properties, and then eventually have this causal history of this eventual state, this kind of causal state that contingently gains the power to produce minds. But it's kind of part of this longer causal history, and the foundation itself can't produce a mind, but the foundation was able to just kind of kick off this chain that eventually is able to produce minds. And so that seems to fit pretty well with, say, evolutionary theory about minds that, like, say, if we start with some natural necessary thing, that can't produce a mind, but eventually down the road we get a biogenesis. And then, so it seems to me with theism, like Josh wants to make that jump from we see minds to the foundation must, he says the foundation must be able to produce a mind, but then he jumps to it must be a mind. But so even just the ability to produce minds, to me, that move seems like we may not have to accept it. So I don't know if that's plausible or not.
So in some sense, if there's a foundation and it does some stuff and eventually there are minds, then the foundation produced the minds. There's a causal chain that leads from the foundation to the minds. But if we're thinking of the foundation as a thing that's got causal powers, maybe there's no other way that it could make minds other than very, very indirectly by a long process that takes billions of years. And then I think your other question's a good one. So why think that the mind, that it's got to have a mind, and that it's having a mind explains why we get the minds at the end of the process? There seems to be a big gap that's opened up. Sorry, that's
so good.
Just turn the sound off.
Okay, yeah. So are you finished on that point then?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, what you say seems plausible. Actually, in my Feser article, I think I talked about the idea that something might have a potential to have a potential without having the potential. So, I mean, a kind of different way you could go which is kind of related, would be that the foundation doesn't have the potential to make minds, but it has the potential to have the potential to make minds, depending upon what else it does.
Right. And then but then we could talk about things like contingent powers, like things might be able to have contingent powers, and it has the potential to create a state of affairs that potentially has this power. So
that's right. No,
So the point you raised is the same one Josh did. He's like, like that's all I mean when I say that the foundation has this power, is that it can at least kickstart this event. And so, but to me, that's not the same thing as saying it has, because I agree with your point that, like, there is a sense in which it caused minds to exist if we have this kind of, per se, causal series, or even accidental, really. So there is a sense in which we can say the foundation caused minds in a kind of a long causal history, but I don't think that's tantamount to saying that the foundation itself can produce minds. So I think there's a difference there that's kind of subtle, but really important for the jump Josh wants to make to this thing having a mind and having these powers. So that's one thing I wanted to pick your brain about, because that was something that kind of was really something I thought about a lot with a lot of, because I mean, it's not only with minds, that's kind of the causal principle he uses all throughout his book to build these divine attributes, is saying, like, we see this thing instantiated, so here's how we explain it. And so it's not just with mind, it's with, like, everything he wants to explain. And so I'm like, well, I don't know that I have to accept that as a naturalist. Right. Seems like we can have at least equally plausible. Well, then the question then becomes, do our contrastive naturalist explanations, are they able to explain it? And so then we get down into that debate. So that's a really good point. Thank you for the clarity there. One thing also, so when we're talking about, another concern Josh has raised about the simplicity question, and one I think you addressed briefly in your book, Naturalism and Religion, but it's kind of come up a lot more I've seen recently, is I think Josh has pointed out, he thinks it's hard to say naturalism simpler, because he doesn't even know what, like, say, naturalism is, because terms like natural are notoriously nebulous and hard to define. And I know one thing you've said in response to this is that, well, all our terms are nebulous and hard to define, even cat or knife, like, all our terms are nebulous and hard to define. But then Josh is just going to say, if we take everything to be primitive, then that doesn't help us in drawing this sharp distinction between naturalism and theism. So one thing I wanted to kind of get your take on was, say, the best way to define natural, because I know one way you put it was like, natural stuff is the stuff that's studied by, like, the natural sciences, but then that seems to be, because you recognize in the book, that seems to almost become circular, because then we have to define what the natural sciences deal with in terms of what we've already assumed. So I did kind of I was curious as to what you think about the best way to define natural is, because Josh is going to want to say, because of all the reasons we listed a little bit earlier, that like, or someone like Josh, I mean, I feel like I'm name dropping him a lot. I'm just saying that people are going to argue that naturalism, it's hard to draw this distinction. It's hard to say it's simpler because it's hard to like draw this really sharp cutoff. And it seems to me kind of just intuitive that a rock is simpler than an angel, or like that a rock is natural and an angel is not. But then once you get down to the nitty gritty of defining terms, people want to like press it. So I was curious as to what you think the best way for us to naturalists to define natural is and kind of escape some of these arbitrary criticisms, or if we need to even.
So one thing that I've said is I'm skeptical that you need a definition, because I will set aside the fact that you can't define knife and cat.
Yeah.
You certainly can't define philosophical terms. I mean, there's the enterprise of analytic philosophy for the first 2/3 of the 20th century was trying to define things like cause, art, knowledge, and so on. And all of those attempts at definition ended in failure. Right? Now, of course, that doesn't prove that we won't one day succeed, but it does seem kind of implausible to me that there just are out there definitions waiting to be found for the terms that we use. When it comes to those other words, we use them, it's kind of unproblematic. The word natural seems to be in the same boat, right? If I give you a list of things and I ask you to say, okay, which of these are the natural ones and which are the non-natural ones, and maybe I have to give you a few examples to get started, you won't have any trouble doing it. So it looks as though there's something to the expression. It's not just a kind of meaningless sound. If you're kind of inclined to think that you want more and that you want a definition, I guess rather than making the definition in terms of natural science, I'll just make it in terms of science. And what I will say is that the natural things are the things that are studied by science. So if we imagined that we had a completed science, we would be able to just read off from it what the natural things are. They would be just the things that are studied in completed science. But probably we could never have a completed science. In any case, we certainly don't have one now. But the best guide that we've got to completed science is current actual science. And we can use that as a guide to help us in sorting the natural and the non-natural. We just ask ourselves, so what things do the sciences study, right? But the sciences here, I'm happy to include not just physics and chemistry and biology, but sociology, perhaps even history amongst the sciences. What it turns out is, and then what the people that you have to consult are the experts in the disciplines, right? So if you're kind of interested in knowing whether there are things of a certain kind and you think that it falls within the purview of a particular discipline, you go and ask the experts. If there's expert consensus, then that's a pretty good guide. The best current guess that we've got is what the experts say. Now, go and do your survey of physics and chemistry, biology, sociology, psychology, and so on, and ask for a range of things. Are they in the purview of this discipline or not? And you will find that there's no scientific discipline that studies ghosts or gods, that postulates them as objects that are going to do explanatory work. And so that's how I see the sorting being done. So it's, in one sense, it's what ideal science is going to do. We don't have it, but the best guide that we've got is current actual science. That's what we should rely on. That's what we use in making our sorting between the natural and the non-natural.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that seems pretty plausible to me. I'm fine with accepting that, but I mean, people are going to, because yeah, it's pretty obvious. I mean, if we ever developed a science that studied things like gods, we may have to change our definition if we'd found those things that existed. But that would kind of falsify naturalism, wouldn't it? Because yeah, I mean, we're not going to ever look in a microscope and see a ghost. So it seems pretty rational to me. Yeah.
In the background is an idea about what science is, and so maybe I should add this.
Yeah.
So the important thing about science is that it's kind of governed by this norm of seeking expert agreement. So in order to establish something as science, in order for something to become established science, it's got to be that there's pretty much universal agreement amongst the experts in the science on that topic. So here's a distinction between science and philosophy. Right? If there's such a thing as expertise in philosophy you don't have that, right? And philosophy isn't in any important sense regulated by that norm of seeking expert agreement. Now, the prospects of having an investigation on which there's universal expert agreement in connection with gods is, in my view, zero, right? It's not going to happen. That's what rules it out of science and rules it, and hence rules it out of naturalism.
Okay.
Right. So there's something else that sits in the background about the importance of the way that a discipline's regulated by this concern to get universal expert agreement. And it turns out that we have managed to find methods and subject matter on which there is universal expert agreement in physics, chemistry, and biology. There's lots and lots of it. Of course, there's lots of stuff in those disciplines that's currently contentious. And then as you go out towards the boundaries, you start straying into philosophy. It becomes unclear whether there are going to be claims in which we can find methods that we can reach settled agreement. That just isn't the aim in religion at all. Right. And it isn't the aim in a whole lot of other non-naturalistic systems of belief either. Right. You're not looking for methods. You're not trying to regulate your investigations by methods that are going to lead all intelligent, thoughtful, reflective people to the same position. Right? Religion actually kind of divides rather than unifies.
Yeah.
In that respect.
Divides, agreement. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Because, I mean, obviously the sciences themselves have their own metaphysical presuppositions about being natural, but it seems like we can kind of almost help our definitions of ontological naturalism with methodological and vice versa, and that kind of plays into that. So I find that plausible. I mean, at the end of the day, people are always going to push back on that and just say it's circular. But I mean, also the way I think about it is if someone really wants to blur the lines that much and just like call themselves a naturalist when they're clearly committed to the existence of at least one God, I'm just going to say, fine, let's compare your naturalistic theory to mine and let's see which naturalism is simpler. And so, I mean, people are going to want to push that and make naturalism seem like untenable or less simple as opposed to because it can't be defined. But even if, I mean, these terms are all nebulous and primitive, if we can't define it, we just go the way of looking at the theoretical virtues. So
right. So, and I agree that it doesn't. I mean, what you call things usually doesn't make a real difference to the outcome. Right. We put down the worldviews and we compare them. And I say mine is simpler than Josh's, right? To take an example.
Even if he wants to call himself a naturalist, he can still do that,
It in a way, it doesn't matter. How we end up using the word naturalism isn't going to impact on the outcome of that comparison. Right. But it does seem to me that it's kind of useful because actually most people do understand the word natural. And one way, I think for theists to think about this is just, okay, so on your view, sorry, now I'll pretend to be a theist. On my view, there's God, and then God makes another domain. That other domain is the natural domain. What the naturalists think is there's that other domain, but there's no God. Right. Now, that's slightly crude, but roughly right. I mean, it's slightly crude because there might be divine interventions as part of your story, and there might be another couple of domains, one where heaven and hell, but also wherever the angels and demons are duking it out or whatever. So you might not think that there's just this one domain, in which case the naturalists have shaved off even more of the picture that you had. But that's what the naturalists have done from your point of view. Right.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to think there.
That's the way that I would think about it, except that then you'll get people saying, oh, but then your view's just kind of derivative. It's supposed mine, and so somehow or other my view's more fundamental. But that's not right. Because I don't think, because then you just think about it from the kind of inside, the internal perspective that I was talking about before, right? So we see what we can get agreement on about what there actually is, what's the and then we kind of hitch our wagon to that, the stuff where we can get expert agreement about things, and it just doesn't build back out to the gods, the angels, the demons, heaven and hell, and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that's derivative. It's just a thought experiment. It's like, no, the stuff that you take to be, completely separate from God, we just say that, or completely separate from all these other categories, we just say that's all there is. That's just to help with some clarity of thinking, not to say that it requires any sort of divine cause. So that's a good thought experiment to use with theists too. It's like, take the book of Genesis and then shave off the first part where God says it, and that's where we're at with naturalism, to put it, even more crudely somehow. But yeah, so that's helpful, definitely, because again, also terms are nebulous, and people are just going to say if you take everything to be primitive, it just becomes meaningless. But as you point out, and it seems obvious to me, is like, we know what we're talking about. Like, you know what I mean when I say naturalism. When I say that there are only natural causal entities, the only things that enter into the causal order are natural, I don't mean demons in that, or I'm not referring to demons in that causal order. So most people know what you're talking about. If people really try to press you, it's like, fine, call it yourself whatever you want, let's just compare. So yeah, I'm not as concerned about that, but some people are. So that's why I wanted to pick your brain on it, given your expertise with naturalism. So thank you. I'm a relatively recent naturalist, so having your help is exceedingly appreciated. So that was one of the big points I wanted to get to. I think we covered simplicity as well, and it seems pretty obvious that simplicity is a theoretical virtue. I mean, even Josh Rasmussen and Proust, Feser, they're all going to agree with that in the end. Well, of course, barring some explanatory data that can't be explained. So it seems to me intuitive that the route the theist is going to have to go is to just cede the point that naturalism is simpler, and then we duke it out on the grounds of explanation. Like, if we can't explain something, to posit a further entity, fine. Like, as long as we don't have to do that, as long as our explanational power is explanatory power is the same, we don't have any, we're going to go with simplicity. So the debate really then becomes just about what we can explain and what we can't. And so it seems as if, so that leads me to an interesting question about like naturalism and explanation. We suppose, obviously you do and I do too, that naturalism can probably explain everything theism can, at least as well, and I'd say in a lot of cases probably better, things like the existence of evil. We don't have to have a logical contradiction to see that naturalism maybe explains these better. But so one question I have for you, if you don't mind answering it, is what do you think is potentially one of the harder things for naturalism to explain? Because so it seems like, so one thing theists are going to want to say, like, they're going to want to say things like contingency or fine tuning, or when you get down to the lower apologetic levels, maybe moral truths and beauty, but those aren't very strong arguments. Seems to me the harder things for naturalism to explain are, say, the rise of minds, and then maybe just contingency in general. So I guess, what do you think is, I mean, obviously you don't think any of it's sufficient to warrant rejecting naturalism, but like, what's something that's more difficult than kind of some of the bad arguments?
So I don't think contingency is a problem.
That much of a problem, no.
Because we've talked about that. So, and there are lots of people who think that the cosmological arguments are the strongest arguments, whereas I'm inclined to think that, if anything, they favour naturalism because it's the simpler view, right? So, if you thought, here's this stuff that needs to be explained, which view should we go with? We should go with the simpler one. Well, it's naturalism, so actually there's no, and for reasons that we've already been over.
Yeah.
There are other topics here that are philosophically difficult. So certainly the question about what views to have about our, I'll say our mindedness, because I don't think that there are minds, right?
Oh, right.
It's
You're an
as an
identity theorist, right?
as an additional ontological entity. So I would prefer not to. I mean, I can talk that way, but you have to take
Right.
it with a grain of salt, because it
Yeah.
really should be translated into something else. Okay, so there's a whole lot of questions about mind that are still very hotly contested amongst philosophers, and the progress that we've made in neuroscience and the other sciences of the mind is kind of impressive, but there's a long way to
Yeah.
go. Right. So there's lots of hard questions. I don't think that though there's anything there that favors theism over naturalism, but it's certainly possible to kind of conflate these two
I see. Yeah.
things. It's a hard area, and so maybe there's some advantage that we'll get from postulating God. I think that the fine tuning goes a bit the same way. It's too early to know exactly where we sit with the idea that there is fine tuning, right?
Yeah. It
Because we
seems so.
don't have a finished physical theory, and so we don't actually know whether there are all of these things, these numbers that have to be put in by hand, or whether in the end they'll all be determined by theory, and there'll be just one way that physical theory says the world has to be.
Yeah.
That's still up in the air at the moment, I think. You might think that it's kind of a straw in the wind. I mean, by my own principles a little while back, surely we should go by how things look at the moment. But then I'm quite happy to argue that naturalism is going to do just as good a job as theism on explaining fine-tuning, if there is fine-tuning. There I disagree with lots of people, not just theists, but some naturalists as well. So I don't think that there's anything particularly in those two areas that's really worrying for naturalism, but they're probably the two areas where, if you accept what I think about the cosmological arguments, those are the two areas where you might think that naturalists are going to have most to worry about.
With minds. Okay. Yeah, that seems plausible. Yeah, the point about, because I've been of the mind for a while in the camp that cosmological arguments tend to be the best, and especially the contingency variants, that the more recent ones. But I'm kind of shifting more to your side. I don't think they're that problematic because we have to explain things either way. So the simplicity is kind of as a whole package. You can take things as a whole package as opposed to individual arguments. You can kind of sift through some of that easier. So one thing, I forgot to mention this when you were talking about defining naturalism in the way of science, and then it kind of came up again. We're talking about fine tuning, and it seems to be the view of, like, say, scientific realism, but like a particular form of that as well, where the science we have is, pretty accurately gives us a pretty accurate picture of the causal order, and not only that, but the current science we have is pretty accurately indicative of the ideal science we're going to have, at least in some sense. Obviously, we don't have a completed science yet, but so that's kind of seems central to some of the points you're making. I think that's hard to deny, that science is not completed, but pretty indicative of what we're going to have.
So, I mean, if you think about cosmology, we have a pretty good idea about what the visible universe is like now. And if you project it back, we have a pretty good idea right back to what's conventionally called maybe the first second of the universe. But everything is up for grabs. We don't have quantum gravity. We don't have any way of reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity once you push down to those really small levels. So we don't know what the crucial bit looks like. Right.
Yeah. like before Planck time, pretty much all of our
But
physics breaks
even
down.
between Planck time and the kind of the inflationary era, what happened before inflation? We have very little good information about. Certainly, we have no idea about before the
Yeah,
Planck time.
definitely not there.
We don't have any theories yet. So that makes discussing it difficult.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, but yeah, it does seem that like it's pretty plausible that our science is accurate and indicative of what we're gonna have. All right, awesome. That's helpful too. So one thing, I don't know if you had any more you wanted to say on that. Well, I was going to ask you one thing. This might be too complex of a question to like get as far into as we need to. But is there any particular reason you don't think minds exist? Sorry, I know that's a big one. We could skip that if you want to.
Okay, so I think that it's misleading to talk about minds because then you end up you think that it makes sense to talk about, so what's the relationship between the mind and the brain?
Yeah.
Whereas I think that we're minded organisms, so we do things like perceive, we're conscious, we feel, we have emotions, and so on. There's a whole lot of stuff that we do. And if you want to explain all these things that we do, you'd have to look to the operation of our central nervous system and our brains. So you might think, for example, if you were going to classify me, I'm certainly not an eliminativist. I'm an identity theorist, right? In the old sort of system of labeling, but I prefer not to talk about minds because that makes it sound like they're these things that have some separate existence and we kind of have to locate them, right? And that doesn't seem right to me. On the other hand, I'm quite comfortable with talk about belief, desire, intention, and so on. So I'm not the kind of Churchland eliminativist or Stitch style eliminativist or whatever, or even a kind of Dennett style sort of perhaps anti-realist about those kinds of things. Yeah, interpretivist about those kinds of things. My views are much closer to the views that Jack Smart had way back.
Right. Yeah, so it would be just not wanting that whole separate category of mind. So, I mean, you wouldn't deny things like qualia exist. You would just deny they exist in some sort of separate, right?
So I'm not sure about talk about qualia. I mean, we certainly we experience things, right? I mean, just to take one kind of example that Jack was fond of, I can tell the colours of things just by looking at them. I can tell you if you put a tomato on the table, I can tell you whether it's ripe or not just by looking at it, right? Now, there's a whole lot of stuff that you might want to know about in order to explain how I can do that, right? And if my ability to do that means that you're going to say I have red qualia, well, I don't know if that's going to feature in my explanation at all. Probably not. My story is going to be one about visual processing and neural processing and states of various kinds that I'm in.
Okay.
That's what I think the full story will be. Now, whether you think that that's a story about qualia or not depends upon exactly what you mean by qualia.
Right. Yeah, no. So yeah, I'm not as well versed in philosophy of mind. I just wanted to hear, because I remember hearing you mention before you're an identity theorist, so I was just curious as to why. So that's interesting. Yeah, it seems like what we think about qualia is going to be kind of dependent on how we define that. Yeah. So there's another thing. This is changing gears a little bit. You talked with this. You mentioned there's something you mentioned kind of passingly in an old conversation you did with Josh Rasmussen on Capturing Creation. You guys did your discussion on the origins of reality, which is probably my favorite philosophical discussion ever. That was just full of gold. 2 hours of pure amazing. But so one thing you mentioned, I think it was more towards the end of that, or it was sort of a recurring theme, but you guys didn't seem to dig into it. And to me, it seems like almost like a novel argument for naturalism, or well, at least atheism. But maybe naturalism. And it's kind of, I guess the best way to call it would be some sort of axiological problem for theism. And so the way you put it, again, it was brief and it was towards the end. So I was kind of wondering what you thought on this now. You said something about how you kind of find it problematic to suppose, like, kind of thinking about how we get from like this perfect state of reality. So we start with this perfect state,
Yep.
and then we get to where we're at now, which is obviously imperfect. So you said you kind of had this sort of like, it's kind of hard to reconcile. Like you kind of had this problem with thinking about how we get perfection from imperfection. And obviously Josh doesn't see the same difficulty. But to me, I feel like there's almost an argument we can make along those lines, like an axiological argument or an axiological creation problem for theism. Like, how do we get from perfection to imperfection? So, because obviously, and of course, Thomas are going to talk about privations and all that, but it doesn't dismiss the point of how we get from no privations to a ton of them. It seems like then God has to create this state so we don't have an. So, it seems like there's an almost novel argument there, but it's, yeah.
So I've mentioned this argument in various places without ever trying to develop it further, because it doesn't feel to me like it needs developing. It's just this is right. It seems it's always so. At least since before I wrote Arguing About Gods, I've been thinking about this, that the idea that you start with perfection and then somehow or other you get from perfection to imperfection seems very hard to understand, right? If you've already got perfection, why is it going to make imperfection? What's in it for perfection to do that? It just doesn't make, it just makes no sense to me at all, especially because what goes along with imperfection is things like suffering and horrendous suffering.
Right.
So I do find that puzzling. On the other hand, I do know that theists typically seem not to see this as a problem. So
yeah, they're not too bothered by it. I don't know why, but because naturalism, obviously, we don't have any sort of like ontological moral categories of any state, so it's kind of like, not an issue. Maybe there's a further point there about simplicity. We don't have kind of to assess states of reality in any kind of moral sense, which makes it a little bit easier. Which also makes me think about like the idea of, ultimately, I think Paul Draper has spelled out this, like his low priors argument, that like, at the end of the day, like we're talking about naturalism, theism, a lot of basically any of our metaphysical theories are going to be some form of source idealism or source physicalism. Either there's physical stuff that eventually produces mental stuff, or there's mental stuff that produces physical stuff. There seems to be kind of like a parallel there, and so it seems hard to kind of square that. So I forget, there was another argument I had along those lines, but I'm forgetting now how I drew it out. I had like some argument I was thinking of about like the eternality of the natural. Oh yeah, that's what it was. It was about causal interaction between physical and non-physical things, because theists seem to want to have this causal principle that physical things can't produce non-physical things, and and then they of course argue then that, like, say things like minds or persons are non-physical, and so they can't be reduced to physical. We don't have to be reductionist to be naturalist. But so what seems to me interesting is they don't think there's a parallel problem of getting physical stuff from non-physical stuff. And so I know this has kind of been like, so material causality, which Felipe Leon's expounded on his ex nihilo argument and some of his other work. But it just seems to me then that we have this kind of, there's almost this argument we can make that, if we accept then these causal principles, if we're going to be fair to the causal principles, we should accept both that non-physical things can't produce physical things and physical things can't produce. So if we're going to accept that, then we just look around and observe, and we observe physical stuff, we observe natural stuff. So if one can't produce the other, one has to be the source, and then one has to be the totality. It seems like then we've got to go with naturalism, because we obviously see natural stuff, and if mental stuff can't produce this natural stuff, then the natural stuff must have always been here, or it's really contingent in some way. So that seems to kind of be a similarly along the lines of the axiological problem, but a little bit different in terms of how we're thinking about causal principles. So do you think it's fair to make that equivocation between those causal principles, or at least like plausible?
Well, I think it is worth asking the question, if you think that the physical could not give rise to the non-physical, why you should be at all tempted by the thought that the non-physical can give rise to the physical. That does seem like it's a fair question to ask.
And then, because then it seems like any answer given to that, I'm trying to like conceive of answers, but like it seems like any answer given to that, I might be able to just flip around and say, well, why can't then the physical?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a similar. We're switching ontological categories, so it's like I fail to see the relevant difference. I mean, I feel like intuitively there may be a difference, but I fail to see it, at least as of yet.
So this does remind me a little bit of some of the early discussion with Descartes about Princess Elizabeth's objection to Descartes. It's very hard to see in the kind of physical causal chain where the non-physical could insert itself to do some causing. I guess she must have said this before Descartes decided that it all happened in the pineal gland. But anyway, I mean, but that wasn't her point. Was that conceptually it's very difficult to understand how there can be this interaction between the physical and the non-physical.
Right. Because it's
because
like one example.
Because it seems like the physical stuff is complete, right? There's if you're thinking about perception, there's light sort of hitting your eyes, and then there's processing in your brain, and then signals are going out, and your arms or whatever are doing stuff. It doesn't look like there's anywhere in that where you need some little to and fro with some non-physical stuff to get it going. And I think she also worried that it didn't even make sense, really.
Yeah.
That picture. It's very hard to see how the non-physical could be interacting on the, influencing the physical.
Right. So then we might be, maybe they could, theists could take some sort of like dualist view on which they're both kind of the source, but I mean, ultimately that seems implausible. Like, so one example my friend Joe likes to give, he was the one who helped me. He was with me when I did my discussion with Josh and with Trent Doherty as well. And he has, so what he talks about, the one example he gives me against like emergentism or like physical things producing non-physical things, he's like, we can't, we couldn't just like rub dirt clods together. Like, no matter how many times a day, we're never going to get like a genie out of that. And so I was like, yeah, that's probably true. But I feel like it's also probably true that how many times I smash two genies into each other, I would never get a dirt clod. It seems to me intuitive then that like, yeah, sure, I think that's probably true. But I also don't see it like we being able to reverse that process and get this kind of like a consistent, because then it seems like, well, why don't we see it happening more? Like, I don't see how we get a consistent causal principle out of reconciling that.
So I guess part of this is why I want to be a kind of monist. There's natural stuff. That's all there is. There isn't. There isn't stuff that I consider to be non-natural. So we didn't really talk about this when we were defining naturalism, but things that I think are actually constitutive of naturalism include the view that minds are late and local. I mean, if we're going to talk about minds at all. So the only minds there are products of biological evolution or downstream products of those things, like maybe we make AIs that have minds eventually. But otherwise, it's just us and whatever organisms have evolved in other solar systems elsewhere in the universe, and whatever organisms have evolved in other universes if there are other universes. But basically it's a long way downstream. It's not until you've got third generation stars that you're going to get organisms, just because it takes that many cycles to develop the ingredients that you need. So and I think if that has been part of naturalism, that view about the distribution of minds, and that gets me into trouble with people like pantheists and panentheists who want to count themselves as naturalists. By my lights, they're not.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I interact with people online who want to call themselves like a panentheistic naturalist, and I'm like, what? That just doesn't seem like at all like I don't know, like what's another term would be, like a polytheist atheist. Like, I don't know. You can't just start. That's why it's helpful to like kind of more definitively defined terms and go from there, and we all know what we're meaning. Yeah. So that's good. That kind of plays in, that it kind of synthesizes your views on like mind, and then kind of some of these causal processes into sort of a coherent view of minds arising in this kind of causal process. That's helpful. Awesome. Well, we covered a lot of ground, and I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll wrap up here in a second. But I just had one more kind of question that comes up a lot and is central. Similarly to existential inertia, it's becoming kind of like a central theme or argument in philosophy of religion that's important when we're talking about atheism versus theism and then naturalism. And that's probably the best layout I've heard of this is David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hart at all, but he's an Eastern Orthodox scholar, and he wrote this book called The Experience of God, which is, it's sort of like a split into three parts. It's a mix of like a long contingency argument and a long argument for mind. Really good. But so one of his kind of central things is he, of course, kind of affirms the PSR. So we've kind of covered actually a lot of what he would claim already. But one thing that he talks about that's a central question, and people are going to attack the idea of naturalism as being able to account for necessary existence. And they're going to say that it's material, physical stuff can't be necessary. So like I know Josh Rasmussen, for example, wants to say that all physical states of reality are contingent. Especially when defining contingent as like dependent on something else for sustenance. So the argument Hart lays out is that we have to have necessary existence, and then matter can't be necessary. And forgetting all the reasons he lays out, I mean, amongst them is things like matter is always susceptible to change. It's always dependent on prior or concurrent states of physical reality. So, but basically, the argument boils down to people like to argue that physical reality can't be necessary. It's always going to be contingent. So obviously naturalists are going to disagree. We're going to think that physical reality can be necessary, or if we're going to have necessary existence in our picture, we're going to disagree, which we seem inclined to do. So I guess my question at the very base level is why think matter can be necessary, and why not doubt that, I guess. Wow.
So I think that theories of modality are just further theories, and they're subject to the same rules as everything else. That is, you want the simplest theory that gives you the most explanatory power overall. And so the picture of modality that I like, because I think that it fits that bill, is going to be one on which every possible way that things can be shares some initial history with the way that things actually are. If you think that all there is the natural universe, then it's going to turn out that the initial part of the natural universe is necessary. It just falls out of the picture. So I think that sort of on the broader theoretical grounds, you should find this attractive, and it is just going to fall out that either that the universe is necessary, or at least that some initial part of the universe is necessary. That is, the universe necessarily exists, some initial part necessarily exists. And I think it's not just that it necessarily exists, but it's necessarily the way that it is necessary as well, until chances start playing out that give you the different possibilities. I think that the intuitions that the universe is contingent are actually generated by the prior belief that God made it. Right? Obviously, if God made the universe, then it's contingent. Right?
Yeah.
But that's a product of theory. It's not, so because I just don't have the intuition that the universe is contingent. On the contrary, as I've thought about it more and more, it's become more and more congenial to me to think that it's necessary. And I don't feel any conflict in having that view. So that's what I would say in response, that what's going on here is that if you've got a prior commitment to a theory that entails that the universe is contingent. That's what actually does all the work, 100% of it.
Right. Yeah, because like, so for example, what Josh will do, like in his conversations, is talk about like, well, he uses a cup. So I don't have a cup handy. So I was going to say like a pencil. He'll say something like, well, this is a physical thing, like this pencil, and doesn't seem to be any reason to suppose, like, it's obviously contingent. No matter how big this pencil gets or how small or how I throw it around, like, it's still contingent. And he's like, so then he builds from there that like this physical, everything, if all this physical stuff we see is contingent, and like the size doesn't seem to be able to be necessary, then why should the aggregate of all physical stuff, if every physical thing we observe we seem to think of as contingent, then why think the aggregate of all physical stuff is not itself contingent? But that maybe falls prey to what you said already. But is there any
Right.
difference there?
So one thing is that the inference looks like it might be questionable, but
Yeah.
that is from the kind of part to whole inferences. They sometimes go wrong. But the important thing isn't about what we see now. So in the initial state, the universe doesn't contain electrons, protons, neutrons. There isn't matter in any familiar sense. Of course, things like pencils
Yeah.
are contingent, right? But what's there in the very early universe, the bit that we don't know about, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing that in our experience tells us that that stuff isn't necessary.
Okay. Yeah, that
Right?
seems
So
plausible. And it's almost like this kind of compositional point. Like I'm not sure we have the frame of reference to extrapolate from some contingent things to, the some. I think that's kind of
yeah,
a classical objection to the contingency argument too. Like Roe makes it that like, we just because if we're gonna be like monists like you, it doesn't seem to be the case that we have to suppose that all physical reality is just a sum of its contingent parts. It can be kind of as an aggregate, kind of in a different category. So it's more than the sum of its parts in a way. So yeah, that's helpful in thinking about those things, because for a while that point was really influential to me and like kind of pushed me back into like this agnosticism, because I was like, well, yeah, it doesn't seem like matter can be necessary, so like what do we do with that? And so all those principles of
yeah.
thinking about that definitely help. So thank you once again for the clarity. Yeah, as I said, I want to be respectful of your time. We're approaching 2 hours now, but I really, really appreciate you being willing to come on and have this conversation. And is there anything else you wanted to get to say, or any work you want to promote, or anything?
Um, there's nothing in particular. I want to say thank you
Okay.
for inviting me on.
Yeah,
That's
of
one
course.
thing. And I will. So before we started, we did talk about what I'm currently working on. So I might as well promote it. Kenny will thank me. So I'm working on a co-authored book with Kenny Pierce, a debate book about the existence of God. We hope that we'll have it done by the end of next year, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay, awesome. So we got that to look forward to, as well as some more back and forth with Ed Feser. So we got the world's leading Thomist and the world's leading naturalist, and that's going to be a great. So yeah, I can't wait for that book. I'll have to add it to my stack here. But yeah, so if that's everything, thank you so much for coming on. I'll go ahead and it's been really helpful and clarity, and this is going to be. I'm going to come back to this conversation a lot. So thank you again. Go ahead and stop the recording here.